The quiet streets of Houston Heights lay under a pall of early morning mist in the late summer of 1973. The neighborhood was unremarkable, an expanse of aging bungalows and small businesses where the faint hum of distant traffic mingled with the chirp of cicadas. It was the kind of place where children rode bicycles on cracked sidewalks, where neighbors exchanged casual hellos, and where families felt, for the most part, secure. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary community was a secret so dark it would fracture the lives of hundreds and leave a scar on the city for decades to come. In a modest, aging apartment on a street lined with crepe myrtle and magnolia trees, an event was about to shatter that fragile calm. Inside, two teenagers stood in the dim light, one trembling with fear, the other with a gun in his hand, his nerves taut and ready to snap. Outside, the morning light crept cautiously over the rooftops, indifferent to the violence unfolding within. The year was 1973. The man who would soon lie dead on that apartment floor was Dean Arnold Corll, a 33-year-old electrician and former candy company executive. To those who knew him casually, or barely at all, he was a fixture in the neighborhood, a man who gave away candy to children, a quiet businessman. But beneath that veneer was a predator responsible for one of the most chilling and extensive serial murder sprees in American history. Corll's victims were young boys and men, abducted, tortured, and killed over a span of just 3 years. The story that would unravel that morning was not simply about one man's crimes, but about the complicity of two teenage accomplices, a community's blind spots, and the harrowing search for justice and closure. Early years and the making of the Candyman. Dean Arnold Corll was born on Christmas Eve, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to Mary Emma Robeson and Arnold Edwin Corll. The family moved several times during his early childhood, eventually settling in Pasadena, Texas, a working-class suburb of Houston. His parents' marriage was turbulent, marked by frequent quarrels and 2 divorces, the second occurring when Dean was still a boy. His mother, protective and hard-working, remarried a traveling salesman, and together they founded a small candy business that would become the foundation of Corll's public persona. Young Dean was a shy and serious child, rarely socializing beyond his immediate family. Diagnosed with rheumatic fever at 7, he was excused from physical education classes, further isolating him from his peers. His early life was marked by contradictions, a quiet sensitivity shadowed by a growing reserve and occasional social awkwardness. By high school, Corll had adopted a modest, almost studious demeanor. He played trombone in the school band, but was otherwise unremarkable to teachers and classmates. After graduation in 1958, he moved with his family closer to Houston so the candy business could expand. His mother and stepfather's entrepreneurial efforts flourished as they operated under brand names like Pecan Prince and later Corll Candy Company. Corll's involvement in the family business was hands-on and intense. He worked long hours operating candy-making machinery and later managing the company's operations. The candy company's move to a bungalow on West 22nd Street in Houston Heights placed Corll in close proximity to local children and teenagers. It was here that he earned the nicknames the Candyman and the Pied Piper, thanks to his habit of handing out free candy to neighborhood kids. But Corll's public persona concealed a darker side. Employees of the candy company and locals would later recall his inappropriate attentions toward teenage boys, sometimes flirtatious, sometimes overt. One teenage employee was fired after reporting unwanted sexual advances by Corll. Despite these warnings, the community's awareness remained limited, buried beneath the veneer of a kindly man with a candy shop. The Army and the Awakening of a Predator. In August 1964, Corll was drafted into the U.S. Army and sent to Fort Polk, Louisiana for basic training. His official military record shows an unblemished service of 10 months before he was granted a hardship discharge in June 1965, on the grounds that he was needed in the family business. It was during his military service that Coral reportedly first recognized his homosexuality and engaged in his first homosexual encounters. Those who knew him afterward noticed subtle changes in his mannerisms and the way he interacted with teenage boys, a growing obsession that would soon manifest in horrific ways. The relationship with David Brooks. In 1967, Coral befriended a 12-year-old boy named David Owen Brooks. Brooks was one of many boys Coral targeted with his candy and promises of friendship and acceptance. Brooks later described Coral as the first adult male who had never mocked his appearance or demeaned him. Over time, Coral's attentions escalated into a sexual relationship that began around 1969. Coral paid Brooks with money and gifts in exchange for sexual acts. Brooks dropped out of high school at 15 and moved between Houston and Beaumont, Texas. During this time, Coral became a quasi-father figure, offering Brooks shelter and financial support. Brooks would soon become complicit in Coral's crimes, assisting in luring victims. Between late 1970 and early 1971, the Houston Heights neighborhood, a low-income enclave of tightly packed houses and modest businesses, began to bear witness to a series of disappearances that would, at the time, go unnoticed by many. The missing were teenage boys and young men, often described as runaways or strays by a city accustomed to the transient and the troubled. But behind closed doors, a far darker pattern was taking shape. David Owen Brooks, a boy Coral had first befriended years earlier, now played a pivotal role in the macabre cycle. Once a shy sixth grader, Brooks had become a shadow of sorts for Coral, a youth who found himself drawn into the older man's world, both for acceptance and the small comforts Coral provided. Brooks's home life was fractured, with divorced parents and little stability. Coral offered a semblance of belonging, a refuge, and, ultimately, a corrupting influence. In December 1970, Brooks led two boys, James Glass and Danny Yates, away from a religious rally. Both 14, they were acquaintances of Brooks and trusted him enough to follow. At Coral's apartment on Yorktown Street, the boys were bound to a four-poster bed, their youthful bodies subjected to the brutal abuses that had become routine. Shortly after, both were strangled and buried in the boat shed Coral rented, a place that would become a grim repository of bodies. Coral's promise to Brooks of a car in exchange for silence and cooperation was more than a simple transaction. It was an investment in loyalty. That green Chevrolet Corvette, gifted to Brooks in early 1971, was a symbol of status in their small world, a grim token that would be linked to the suffering of many. Coral and Brooks operated with chilling coordination, using the promise of parties, beer, or a simple ride home to lure teenage boys from the streets and social gatherings. One of the most tragic ironies was that many of the victims were known to Brooks or Henley, sometimes friends or acquaintances, making the betrayals all the more profound. On January 30th, 1971, two brothers, Donald and Jerry Waldrop, were walking home after a day of casual plans. The Waldrop brothers had been dropped off by their father and decided to walk the rest of the way. It was a moment that seemed unremarkable, ordinary even, but it was the last day their family would see them alive. Brooks, alongside Coral, intercepted them. At Coral's rented apartment on Mangum Road, the boys were bound, assaulted, and strangled. Their bodies joined the growing number concealed within the rented boat shed, the grim holding place for Coral's victims. As the victims mounted, the local police often dismissed the disappearances as typical teenage runaways. The city's undercurrent of youth homelessness and transience obscured the horror beneath. Families searched desperately, printing posters and pleading for information. Among them was 15-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley, a friend of some victims who would later become entangled in the darkest corners of the case. Henley, like Brooks, had been drawn into Coral's orbit, What began as admiration and friendship became complicity. Coral's allure was complicated, a mix of menace and charisma, blending kindness with cruelty. Henley's own story would later become one of betrayal, survival, and violent confrontation. In March 1971, 3 more victims vanished from Houston Heights, including Randall Harvey, a 15-year-old boy last seen riding his bicycle toward Oak Forest, where he worked part-time. Brooks was again involved in these abductions, helping Coral lure the boys. At Coral's apartment, each would meet the same fate: restrained, sexually assaulted, tortured, and killed. Harvey's death was marked by a single gunshot to the head. Alongside Harvey were David Hilligist, 13, and Gregory Malleywinkle, 16, last seen in late May 1971. Both were taken together to an apartment rented by Coral on West 11th Street. Their bodies, like many others, were hidden away beneath layers of plastic and lime, painstakingly concealed from the world. The parents of Hilligist and Winkle, like so many others, clung to hope. Posters were printed offering rewards for information, distributed by grieving families and volunteers. It was in these moments of desperation that Henley, still unaware of the full scope of Coral's crimes, helped spread the flyers, attempting to offer reassurance to friends and neighbors that their missing children might be safe. The sense of normalcy around Coral's presence in Houston Heights was shattered in small increments, invisible to most, but increasingly heavy to those closest to the victims. Henley met Dean Coral through David Brooks, who had been Coral's accomplice for several years. Brooks, by then a young man steeped in Coral's twisted world, had already taken part in luring victims to Coral's addresses, cementing a pattern of abuse and murder that no one outside their circle suspected. Unlike Brooks, who'd known Coral since childhood, Henley was an outsider, drawn in by a strange mixture of fascination and fear. Coral was charismatic in a cold, calculating way, a man who offered free candy, gifts, money, and a semblance of acceptance to boys who were often ignored or mistreated elsewhere. Henley later recounted feeling caught between revulsion and loyalty, caught in a labyrinth of coercion and control. Over the months, he would be drawn deeper into Coral's world, a world where teenage boys were promised parties and drugs, then trapped in horror. Between 1971 and 1973, the murders escalated. Coral, with Henley and Brooks' help, continued to abduct, torture, and kill victims at a staggering pace. The horrors were carried out in plain sight of neighbors who noticed strange comings and goings, but could not piece together the puzzle. Henley's role grew as he helped Coral find victims, often teenagers from the neighborhood or acquaintances of Brooks and himself. Their method was chillingly methodical: entice a boy with the promise of fun, drugs, or alcohol, drive him to Coral's residence, then restrain and abuse him. The bodies, many bound and wrapped in plastic, were buried in several discreet locations: a rented boat shed in southwest Houston, a beach on the Bolivar Peninsula, dense woods near Lake Sam Rayburn, or secluded areas in Jefferson County. The scale of the killings staggered investigators when finally uncovered. The authorities had been puzzled by a growing number of missing teenagers, often chalking them up to runaways or juvenile delinquents. But no pattern connected the disappearances until August 8, 1973. That night would change everything. August 8, 1973, began like any other humid summer evening in Pasadena, Texas, a quiet suburb southeast of Houston. But inside a modest ranch-style home on Miller Street, tension simmered beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. Elmer Wayne Henley had spent the day in turmoil. His relationship with Dean Coral was fraying under the weight of years of complicity, fear, and resentment. Henley was no longer just an unwilling accomplice. He was beginning to see the monstrous reality of what Coral had done, and the lives destroyed. That night, something inside Henley snapped. The argument between Henley and Coral escalated quickly. Voices rose, emotions boiled over, and what began as a confrontation ended in fatal violence. Henley took a .22 caliber pistol, the very weapon Coral had used in his murders, and shot him multiple times, killing the man known locally as the Candyman. With Coral dead, Henley faced a choice: silence or confession. He chose the latter. Soon after, Henley called police to the house. His confession was chilling in its calm detail, a catalog of abductions, torture, and murders spanning years. He led investigators to the first mass grave, a boat shed where many bodies were buried in plastic wrappings and lime. Over the following days, law enforcement uncovered more graves. On the Bolivar Peninsula Beach, in dense East Texas woods, and in Jefferson County. In total, 28 victims were exhumed. All teenage boys and young men, many as young as 13. Their bodies bore evidence of prolonged torture and sexual assault, a brutal testament to Coral's cruelty and the complicity of his young accomplices. The sheer scale of the crimes stunned the community and law enforcement alike. It was the worst serial killing case the Houston area had seen, and it thrust the quiet streets of Houston Heights and Pasadena into the national spotlight. Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks were both arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. Brooks, only 16 at the time of his arrest, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Henley, then 17, was convicted of 6 counts but was spared the death penalty because it was on hold during that period. He received life sentences as well. The trial and investigation revealed more than just the crimes. They exposed a community's failure to see the warning signs, a justice system ill-prepared for such a case, and the fragile lives caught in a web of violence and manipulation. In the decades that followed, Henley would come up for parole repeatedly, each time facing fierce opposition from victims' families and the public. David Brooks died in prison in 2020 from COVID-19 complications. The lives behind the numbers. Behind the cold count of 28 recovered bodies lay real lives, hopes, and stories abruptly cut short. Each victim was a teenage boy, some neighbors, some strangers, lured into a nightmare they never saw coming. Jeffrey Allen Conan was the first known victim. An 18-year-old college freshman from the University of Texas, he vanished while hitchhiking home in September 1970. His parents would never know the full horror until decades later, when forensic analysis uncovered the circumstances of his death. Manual strangulation, bound and gagged, buried beneath a boulder on High Island Beach. Others were close to Coral's circle. James Glass and Danny Yates, both 14, attended a religious rally in Houston Heights before being lured away by David Brooks to Coral's apartment. Their bodies were found tied to a 4-poster bed, evidence of the torture and murder that had become routine. Randell Harvey, only 15, worked part-time at a gas station. His family last saw him cycling toward work on a warm March afternoon. Like the others, he was abducted, held alive for days, and ultimately shot in the head. Then there were those whose disappearances rattled the local community. Donald and Jerry Waldrop, teenage brothers snatched from a neighborhood street while walking home. Their murders, like so many others, were marked by cold premeditation and a ruthless desire to erase their existence. Some victims were friends of the accomplices. David Hillagist, a lifelong friend of Elmer Henley, disappeared, leaving behind a void that Henley initially tried to mask by distributing reward posters himself. For years, families lived in limbo, haunted by absence, clinging to hope, enduring the silence. Some victims were never identified, their remains marked only as John Doe, or by grim nicknames like the swimsuit boy. A young victim found in a bathing suit whose identity remains a haunting mystery to this day. Decades later, forensic science began to offer answers once thought impossible. Dr. Sharon Derrick, a forensic anthropologist, devoted over 20 years to painstakingly examining the recovered remains. Working through skeletal analysis, dental records, and forensic genealogy, she brought names back to the forgotten, closing painful chapters for grieving families. Her work was slow, methodical, and often heartbreaking. Bones long buried in lime and plastic had to be carefully extracted and analyzed, sometimes yielding just fragments from which to reconstruct identity. One of her major breakthroughs was confirming the identity of Donnie Falcon, a boy who had vanished in 1971 and whose fate had been a source of speculation for decades. His sister, Deborah Christie, remembered the years of uncertainty before the closure brought by Derrick's work. "I have no doubts," Christie said. "When his body came home, my mother hugged it and cried. It was almost 45 years of waiting." But the scientific quest also uncovered painful truths, evidence that some remains previously unidentified could not be conclusively matched with missing persons. Some cases remain open. The full extent of Coral's victims likely never fully known. The spring of 2012 was loud in Canada, though not always in ways people could pinpoint. The national conversation flickered between looming federal budget cuts and the tuition protests raging in Montreal, where tens of thousands of students in red squares choked the streets for nights on end. Helicopters throbbed overhead, and riot police with visored helmets pushed against young protesters, wielding placards about debt, class war, and the politics of austerity. Canada's illusion of quiet civility, already strained by the financial hangovers of the late 2000s, was beginning to fray. At the same time, in the darker corners of the internet, a different kind of unrest gathered. Anonymous online collectives, fueled by equal parts boredom, cruelty, and civic vigilante instinct, swapped rumors of a man they called the Vacuum Kitten Killer. The videos had begun surfacing in 2010. Grainy, shaky clips of a young man, clean-featured and indifferent, suffocating kittens in unspeakable ways. Forums erupted. Users swore to track him down, some driven by rage, others by the addictive lure of digital manhunts. But the wider world wasn't watching yet. Not until the man in the videos graduated from animals to people. This was the terrain into which Luca Rocco Magnotta stepped. A world buzzing with economic anxiety, class resentment, and a culture newly addicted to watching its own horrors in real time. The mechanisms of surveillance, the same ones meant to protect, were already being turned inward, weaponized by civilians with Wi-Fi and nothing to lose. The line between spectacle and crime was blurring, and no one noticed it faster than Magnotta. Born Eric Clinton Newman in Scarborough, Ontario, Magnotta's origins had the familiar bleakness of 100 other true crime footnotes. His parents were teenage sweethearts who should never have married. His father, diagnosed schizophrenic, faded out early. His mother, deeply religious and prone to punishing emotional coldness, homeschooled him until age 12, locking him and his siblings outside for hours and, by his own later claims, killing family pets. Magnotta cycled through group homes as a teenager after his own diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia at 18. He failed out of high school. A minor fraud conviction in 2004 marked his first official brush with the law. But what Magnotta craved wasn't crime. It was notoriety. He chased it through modeling auditions, reality TV applications, gay porn loops, and dozens of meticulously photoshopped fan pages dedicated to his own image. His fixation was fame by any means, a pathological echo of a culture that increasingly rewarded performance over authenticity. Long before his crimes, Luca Magnotta was what the internet made of him. A product of pixelated myth, an avatar stitched together from eroticized danger and mid-tier celebrity delusions. On the night of May 24, 2012, Jun Lin, a 33-year-old international student from Wuhan, China, stepped into Magnotta's Montreal apartment. Lin had arrived in Canada to study computer science, quiet and diligent, keeping close ties to his ex-boyfriend and shielding his sexuality from his conservative family back home. His last text message was sent at 9:03 p.m. By morning, he was dead. The video surfaced days later, anonymously uploaded to gore sites and dark corners of the web. Titled "One Lunatic, One Ice Pick," it depicted a young man, face partially obscured, stabbing a bound Lin with a screwdriver, spray-painted silver to resemble an ice pick. The assault was frenzied, punctuated by necrophilic acts and brief, performative gestures toward the camera. A small dog appeared on screen, licking at the corpse. The soundtrack was True Faith by New Order. Forensic analysts would later catalog 6 tools used in the dismemberment: a screwdriver, scissors, 2 kitchen knives, an oscillating saw, and a hammer. The sequence wasn't clinical, it was theatrical, made for the camera and for whoever would find it. Magnotta mailed parts of Lin's body to political party headquarters in Ottawa, a severed hand to the Liberal Party, a foot to the Conservative Party. Accompanying notes threatened further killings, laced with grade school verse. Roses are red, violets are blue. The police will need dental records to identify you, bitch. The torso was found stuffed in a suitcase behind Magnotta's apartment. It had been sitting there for 2 days, overlooked by overwhelmed garbage collectors during a Montreal student riot protest. By the time the video was flagged and Lin's body identified, Magnotta was already in Europe. He boarded a plane to Paris using his own passport the morning after the murder, blending in with the throngs of travelers moving through Charles de Gaulle under heightened anti-terror security. In a year when France was cracking down on anarchist cells and student uprisings of its own, no one was looking for a man like him. Interpol issued a red notice, effectively an international arrest warrant, and for days, Magnotta was one of the most visible fugitives on the planet. His face flashed on news broadcasts and the Interpol homepage as online sleuths combed through old modeling photos, porn aliases, and YouTube rants. Magnotta taunted them with posts claiming he was in New York, London, or Rome. In truth, he spent the next several days wandering Paris, then Berlin, staying in budget hotels and crashing with casual acquaintances, including one man who later told police he thought Magnotta was just a flirty Canadian tourist. His undoing came not by elite manhunt, but because of his own vanity. On June 4, 2012, Magnotta walked into an internet cafe in the Neukölln district of Berlin and began reading news reports about himself. An employee recognized his face from a local tabloid and quietly alerted police. Minutes later, Magnotta was in custody. His final words before arrest: "You got me." Back in Canada, the trial was a media circus. Magnotta pleaded not guilty, admitting to the acts, but claiming diminished responsibility due to schizophrenia. Expert witnesses clashed over his mental state. The defense cited paranoid schizophrenia and psychosis. Crown psychiatrists countered with diagnoses of antisocial, histrionic, and borderline personality disorders. The jury didn't deliberate long. On December 23, 2014, they returned a verdict of guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, indignity to a human body, distribution of obscene materials, and criminal harassment of government officials. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. In a statement read by the prosecutor, Jun Lin's father said, We lost a lifetime of hope, our futures, parts of our past. The murder has robbed us not only of Lin Jun, but our ability to think and talk about him without pain and shame. Magnotta's story didn't end with his incarceration. In 2015, from prison, he placed a personal ad seeking a Prince Charming pen pal. 2 years later, he married another inmate at a medium-security facility. In 2019, Netflix's Don't Fuck with Cats brought his crimes, and the obsessive amateur investigators who tracked him, to a new generation of viewers. This was the world Magnotta anticipated. One where horror metastasized through screens, where killers could stage their acts as digital performance pieces. He understood something ugly about contemporary life, that in the economy of attention, murder was currency. As of 2025, Luca Magnotta remains imprisoned at La Macasa Institution in Quebec. He will be eligible for parole in 2034. The fog of 2012 has long since lifted, but the world it revealed, a world where violence seeks an audience, and strangers chase shadows through screens, never left. It lives in the margins, in the cache of closed forums and old viral videos, in the long digital memory of a culture that can't look away. In the autumn of 1987, the city of Toronto pulsed with uneasy energy. The Cold War, though nearing its end, still cast a long shadow over North America, breeding a collective unease in the air. Fear of the Soviet Union's missile capabilities mixed with the rising specter of urban crime, all set against a backdrop of economic uncertainty and shifting social mores. Scarborough, a sprawling suburban district on Toronto's eastern edge, embodied this uneasy transformation. A patchwork of working-class neighborhoods, transient immigrant families, and quiet streets suddenly rattled by a growing threat. Bus stops under flickering street lamps became places of dread for young women. The public transit system, lifeblood for many Scarborough residents, turned into a hunting ground after dark. Mothers clutched their daughters closer, police patrolled with sharper eyes, but the fear was palpable and mounting. The city whispered of an unknown predator stalking its streets, the Scarborough rapist, a ghost whose name carried menace, but whose face remained elusive. The city was vulnerable in these shadows, exposed by changing social dynamics, inadequate safety measures, and a growing distrust in institutions. The 1980s had birthed a culture of increasing awareness about sexual violence, but law enforcement and public policy still lagged behind. Victims' voices often went unheard or were met with suspicion. In Scarborough, this societal blind spot allowed the nightmare to fester. Into this fraught landscape stepped Paul Kenneth Bernardo, a man whose ordinary facade concealed an extraordinary darkness. Behind the calm suburban veneer, Bernardo was already plotting a reign of terror that would shatter families, erode community trust, and expose deep fractures in Canadian society. The making of a monster. Paul Bernardo was born on August 27, 1964, in Scarborough, Ontario, the youngest of 3 children in a family that bore scars far deeper than any visible bruise. Kenneth Walter Bernardo, his father, was a man who cast a long shadow of dysfunction and abuse. His mother, Marilyn Elizabeth Eastman, suffered from depression and agoraphobia, retreating from the family emotionally and physically. The home was not a refuge, but a crucible of secrets, pain, and repression. From an early age, Bernardo's life was shaped by trauma that would seed his later horrors. His older sister, Deborah, endured sexual abuse by their father, a fact that rippled silently through the family. Bernardo himself was exposed to violent and controlling behaviors, but beneath the surface, he presented as an affable, even charming boy. Scouts Canada was a haven where he adopted the appearance of a normal, well-adjusted youth, masking the pyromaniac urges and dark fantasies that lurked within. The revelation at age 16 that Kenneth Bernardo was not his biological father fractured Paul's identity further. His mother's scathing insults, calling him a bastard from hell, and his own growing rage culminated in acts of defiance and destruction. One girlfriend's belongings went up in flames after she left him, a signpost on the path to violence that was yet to come. His social interactions became a twisted game of control and humiliation. Bernardo and his circle of friends practiced aggressive pickup tactics on women. But for him, this was less about connection and more about dominance. The line between sex and violence blurred, and his relationships spiraled into threats and physical abuse. By 1987, the veneer was cracking. Scarborough's public transit corridors became the stage for a predator who stalked with chilling precision. Young women, often alone and vulnerable, were followed from bus stops, dragged into shadows, and violated with brutal ferocity. Bernardo's method was calculated. He knew how to blend in, to manipulate, and to evade. May 4th, 1987, marked one of the earliest known attacks in Bernardo's escalating spree. A 21-year-old woman was raped in front of her parents' house after he followed her home. The brazenness of this attack shocked the community, but also fueled a growing fear that the offender might strike again. 2 weeks later, on May 14th, another young woman, 19 years old, was assaulted in the backyard of her parents' home. By July, Bernardo attempted rape again, but fled when his victim fought back. The attacks grew in frequency and intensity. Bernardo's predation was marked by a cold calculation. On September 29, 1987, he escalated to breaking into a 15-year-old girl's home, entering her bedroom, assaulting her with a knife, biting her ear, and fleeing only when the victim's mother intervened. That same crime wrongly condemned Anthony Hannemeyer, a young man who spent 16 months imprisoned for a crime Bernardo committed. As the attacks continued through the late 1980s, the Scarborough community lived in a state of suspended terror. Police warnings urged women to travel in groups and avoid certain bus stops after dark, but the assaults did not abate. Bernardo's confidence grew alongside the terror he inflicted. While the city recoiled from an invisible assailant, Bernardo moved freely through everyday life. He attended Sir Wilfrid Laurier Collegiate Institute and later the University of Toronto Scarborough, working by day in sales for Amway, a company known for its aggressive, almost cult-like marketing tactics that seemed to resonate with Bernardo's controlling personality. His relationship with Karla Homolka, whom he met in October 1987 at a pet store conference, provided a disturbing new chapter in his life. Karla was not merely a passive partner, but an active participant, encouraging and facilitating Bernardo's sadistic behavior. Their relationship would culminate in crimes that horrified the nation. Bernardo's ability to compartmentalize, to be a seemingly normal man at work and school, and a monster in the shadows was central to his capacity to evade detection for years. He delighted in humiliating his dates, engaged in aggressive sexual violence, and threatened death if his abuses were revealed. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka's relationship became a horrifying partnership of sadism and manipulation. Their first victim within the family was Karla's younger sister, Tammy Homolka. In an unimaginable betrayal, Karla drugged Tammy's spaghetti sauce with Valium, allowing Bernardo to sexually assault her while Karla watched. Months later, they administered a fatal mix of sleeping pills and halothane, videotaping themselves abusing Tammy until she died. The official cause was ruled accidental choking, but the truth would eventually shatter that narrative. Bernardo's cruelty escalated beyond the family. 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey was abducted after being locked out of her home. Bernardo blindfolded her, drove her to a remote house, and with Carla filmed hours of torture and sexual assault. Leslie's pleas for mercy, captured on tape, revealed the depths of Bernardo's depravity. The following year, 15-year-old Kristen French vanished, enduring similar brutal torture before her murder. Their deaths shocked the nation and galvanized a massive manhunt. Despite mounting evidence, Bernardo eluded capture until DNA evidence and tips from those close to him finally linked him to the Scarborough rapist. His arrest in 1993 marked the end of a reign of terror. Psychiatrists who assessed Bernardo labeled him a psychopath and sexual sadist, driven by a narcissistic personality disorder. His fantasies of controlling and breeding victims revealed a chilling detachment from humanity. The case exposed glaring failures in policing and justice. Carla's plea deal, exchanging testimony for a reduced sentence, ignited controversy and divided public opinion. Today, Bernardo remains imprisoned, repeatedly denied parole, as victim families continue to live with profound trauma. Transfers to less secure prisons sparked public outrage, reflecting the lingering wounds from his crimes. At parole hearings, Bernardo's evasive admissions and limited remorse demonstrate a man still ensnared by denial, his legacy a brutal reminder of unchecked evil. They said it was the kind of place where you left your back doors unlocked. A modest sprawl of terraced houses and neat brick bungalows, Hyde clung to the eastern fringe of Greater Manchester, like a town out of time. A place where people still nodded to one another in the street and knew their neighbors by name. A pub on every corner, fish shops doing steady trade, and the hills of Saddleworth Moor looming gray on the horizon. But the people of Hyde understood darkness. They knew what evil looked like. In the 1960s, two of their own, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, had lured local children to their deaths, burying them out on the cold, endless moor. The names of the victims were carved into the town's history like an open wound. Pauline, Keith, Leslie Ann. Their ghosts lingered in whispered warnings to children to be home before dark. Hyde had paid its dues to horror. By the 1990s, people assumed the worst of times were behind them. The world outside might have felt more dangerous, but Hyde was still a town where elderly women met for tea on market days and children rode bikes in cul-de-sacs. And in the heart of it all, there was one man they trusted above all others. Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman. The quiet, heavy-set GP with thick glasses and a beard, who made house calls on foggy afternoons and spoke with the kind of plain, unhurried authority that put people at ease. A doctor from the old school. He never left a patient waiting long, knew your family by name, and always found time for a cup of tea. They called him Fred. He called his patients love. What they didn't know was that for over 2 decades, Harold Shipman was killing them, one by one. If there was a defining moment in Harold Shipman's life, it came in the summer of 1963. 17 years old, a bright, reserved boy on the Bestwood estate in Nottingham, Shipman watched his mother Vera waste away from terminal lung cancer. There was no hope of recovery, only comfort remained. And so the doctor came, daily now, administering doses of morphine until the pain dulled and Vera slipped into the narcotic hush of dying. Shipman sat by her side, watching as the drug took away her agony, gave her peace, and finally claimed her. In those final weeks, he saw something else. He saw power. The ability to end suffering with a simple injection. The quiet, intimate control over life and death. 6 years later, he graduated from Leeds School of Medicine and entered the National Health Service. In 1975, Shipman was caught forging prescriptions for pethidine, an opioid painkiller, for his own use. He was hooked. Injecting himself with doses so large his veins collapsed, charged with forgery and drug offenses, he narrowly avoided being struck off the medical register. Rehab followed, a second chance. By 1977, he arrived in Hyde, a little-known doctor with a past buried under polite introductions. And Hyde, a town eager to forget its own horrors, embraced him. 21 Market Street, Shipman opened his own practice. It was modest, unassuming even. Ivy crept up the walls. Patients waited on cracked plastic chairs under faded posters about flu jabs and cholesterol. But inside, he built a thriving list of loyal patients, most of them elderly women. They adored him. He was the old-school doctor who still made house calls, who'd visit on a chilly evening just to check on a chesty cough. He took time. He cared. He joked and teased. And when they died, and so many did, he was there to comfort grieving relatives, sign the death certificates, and advise against a post-mortem. There was no need for it, he'd say. Natural causes, old age, a merciful release. What no one realized was that Harold Shipman was killing his patients with carefully administered doses of diamorphine, medical-grade heroin, a small injection, quick, clean, untraceable, especially if the body was cremated. The deaths mounted quietly, dozens, then scores. He was methodical, but something inside him couldn't stop. In the summer of 1998, John Shaw, a local taxi driver, began to notice a pattern. Time and again, he'd take the town's elderly residents to Shipman's surgery. Many seemed well enough, chatty, alert, looking forward to market day or visits from family. And then they'd be dead. Too many, Shaw thought. It's not right. When he approached the police, they politely dismissed him. Without proof, what could they do? Old people died. That was life. But Shaw wasn't the only one who noticed. Dr. Linda Reynolds, another local GP, was troubled by the number of cremation forms passing through her office with Shipman's signature. Elderly women, most of them living alone, found dead shortly after a visit from the doctor. She raised it with the local coroner. Police made quiet inquiries, but Shipman, cool and assured, talked his way through the questions. No case, nothing to see. The investigation was shelved. Shipman, emboldened, went back to work. Then came Kathleen Grundy, a formidable figure in Hyde. The 81-year-old former mayoress was sharp, spry, and anything but frail. On 23 June 1998, Shipman visited her home for a routine check. 4 hours later, she was dead. He recorded the cause of death as old age and suggested cremation. But Kathleen Grundy had a daughter, Angela Woodruff, a solicitor, sharp as glass. And when Angela discovered a new will, leaving her mother's £386,000 estate to Harold Shipman, she knew something was wrong. She went to the police, insisted on an exhumation. When forensic tests revealed lethal levels of diamorphine in Grundy's tissues, the case cracked open. Police raided Shipman's home and surgery. There they found records altered after deaths, a typewriter used to forge Grundy's will, jewelry belonging to other patients, a pattern of deaths dating back 2 decades. The town's beloved doctor was unmasked as Britain's most prolific serial killer.
On October 1999, Shipman stood trial at Preston Crown Court, charged with 15 murders and 1 count of forgery. The evidence was overwhelming. His clinical calm in the witness box only deepened public horror. No explanation, no remorse.
On 31 January 2000, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. Sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life tariff, Harold Shipman would never see freedom again. But the final tally was far higher. The Shipman inquiry, led by Dame Janet Smith, concluded in 2002 that he had killed at least 215 patients. Later estimates placed the number closer to 250. His youngest victim, just 4 years old. In Wakefield Prison, isolated and unrepentant, Shipman remained silent about his crimes. His wife Primrose insisted on his innocence.
On January 3, 2004, the eve of his 58th birthday, Shipman hanged himself in his cell.
To many, it felt like a cheat. Families of the victims were denied the answers they longed for. His suicide, though, brought a finality.
The Shipman inquiry led to sweeping reforms in medical practice, death certification, and cremation procedures. It forced Britain to confront its blind trust in authority and the ease with which monsters could hide behind respected titles.
In Hyde, the wounds linger. Market Street surgery was shuttered. A memorial garden stands in memory of the lost. And the question remains, how did no one see it sooner?
Why did he do it? No one knows. Not really. Some claimed it was Shipman's way of playing God, exercising the ultimate power, deciding who lived and who died. Others believed he was obsessed with control, a narcissist whose need for dominance escalated into murder. Maybe it began as mercy, a desire to spare suffering, but it became something darker, a compulsion, a habit. A man lost to his own monstrosity. As Dame Janet wrote in the inquiry's final report, it seems that Shipman derived a sense of satisfaction from the act of murder itself. He showed no remorse, no humanity. He exercised the most terrible power, and did so with chilling indifference. In the end, Harold Shipman died as he lived, alone, a trusted figure no one truly knew, the angel of death, the doctor who killed.
In the wake of Shipman's conviction and suicide, Britain was left reeling. It wasn't just the scale of his crimes that unsettled the country. It was the fact that they had happened at all. For decades, Harold Shipman had been the last man many people saw before they died. And he had killed them while wearing the mantle of trust, authority, and care. The government ordered an exhaustive inquiry. Headed by Dame Janet Smith, it would take 5 years and cost more than £21 million. The findings were damning. The Shipman inquiry confirmed at least 215 murders. But even this number came with a caveat. Due to the cremation of so many bodies, the true total would likely never be known. Some experts believed the number of victims could have been as high as 260. The inquiry didn't just look at Shipman's crimes. It examined the systemic failures that allowed him to kill undetected. It found that there was no effective monitoring of death rates among GPs. The certification of deaths was lax and relied too heavily on the word of one doctor. Local coroners failed to spot abnormal patterns of deaths linked to Shipman's practice. The NHS had no reliable systems for tracking controlled drug prescriptions like diamorphine. As a result, the UK overhauled its processes for death certification and cremation paperwork. A national system for monitoring GP mortality rates was introduced. Controlled drugs became subject to stricter regulations. It was a reckoning not just for British healthcare, but for a nation's willingness to place absolute trust in the medical profession. Yet for the families of victims, reforms came too late. Shipman's name, once a fixture of trust, became a byword for betrayal. In Hyde, the community struggled to forgive itself for loving a man who had murdered so many of their mothers, grandmothers, and neighbors. Harold Shipman refused to fade quietly from Britain's consciousness. In the years following his death, his story proved too lurid, too grotesque, and too irresistible for the media to ignore. In 2002, ITV aired Harold Shipman, Dr. Death, a dramatization of his crimes, with actor James Bolam in the title role. The film reignited outrage from victims' families, but drew huge viewership. A string of other productions followed, Beyond Belief, Scenes from the Shipman Inquiry, a stark stage play that used actual inquiry transcripts, was performed in Manchester in 2004. Harold Shipman, Dr. Death, a documentary with new testimonies, aired in 2018, though critics noted it offered little new. The Shipman Files, a very British crime story, a 2020 BBC documentary series, examined not just his crimes, but how British society enabled them. His infamy seeped into satire too. In 2001, the notorious Viz comic published a cartoon titled Harold and Fred, They Make Ladies Dead, pairing Shipman with fellow serial killer Fred West. Outrage followed. The artist Cold War Steve has repeatedly featured Shipman in his surreal political collages, a symbol of trusted authority gone monstrous. Even pop music wasn't immune. The post-punk band The Fall referenced him by name in their 2005 track What About Us. Most recently, in 2025, Shipman's ghost resurfaced on the reality game show The Traitors. In a heated roundtable, a contestant compared a medical doctor on the show to Shipman, a moment that immediately went viral, with Shipman trending on social media once again. Each appearance prompted the same cycle: shock, anger, fascination. Britain, it seemed, could neither forgive nor forget. What remains hardest to reconcile is that Harold Shipman was utterly ordinary, not a raving lunatic, not a shadowy figure in the night, but a man who lived in a modest home, tended a garden, went on holiday to the seaside, and drove a sensible car. His neighbors remembered his gruffness. His patients adored him. Colleagues envied his patient list. And through it all, he killed. More than 250 lives taken, one injection at a time. He didn't murder for wealth. The forged will of Kathleen Grundy appeared to be an aberration. He didn't kill for sexual gratification, nor as a mercy. It was power, pure, unfiltered dominion over life and death. He could stop a heart, sign the certificate, offer condolences, and walk away unchallenged. The embodiment of evil in plain sight. As Dame Janet Smith reflected, the case of Harold Shipman is profoundly disturbing because it makes us question how well we really know those in whom we place our deepest trust. In the end, Harold Shipman left behind more than victims. He left a nation forever altered, a town scarred, and a cautionary tale of how darkness can wear the face of decency. And in Hyde, the old pub warnings to children about the moor had to make room for a new ghost. The doctor who killed. The wind moaned through the bare branches of the forest surrounding Plainfield, Wisconsin. Shadows thickened with the falling dusk, swallowing the jagged edges of a small wooden shed. Inside, the air hung heavy with a coppery stench, a mixture of earth and something far more unsettling. Hanging upside down by his ankles from a crude wooden crossbar was the headless, gutted body of a woman. Blood had darkened the worn floorboards beneath her, and nearby, a burlap sack lay heavy with its grim burden. A sheriff's deputy approached cautiously, his flashlight trembling in the chill as it illuminated walls lined with human skulls, some decorated with frayed ribbons like trophies of a nightmare. Bowls made from skulls, lampshades stitched from human skin, and belts fashioned from human nipples cluttered the room, telling a story more horrifying than any fiction. And there, in the center of this macabre shrine, stood the man responsible, Edward Gein. His eyes were dull, his voice soft and confused as he muttered, "I just wanted to be my mother." Edward Theodore Gein was born in the waning summer of 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. The second son of George and Augusta Gein, Edward's early years were marked by an intense and complicated devotion to his mother. Augusta was a stern, fervently religious woman whose puritanical worldview shaped the isolated world her sons inhabited. From early on, Augusta preached the inherent sinfulness of the world. She warned her children of lust and temptation, painting women broadly as harbingers of moral decay. In this atmosphere thick with fear and repression, Edward's identity and affections became narrowly focused, fixated almost exclusively on his mother. George Gyne, a carpenter and local fireman, left the city behind to farm a 155-acre plot in the rural town of Plainfield. The farm was as much a prison as a home, isolated and sheltered from the outside world. Augusta's rigid rules governed the family, cutting the boys off from peers and normal socialization.
At school, Edward was shy and awkward, haunted by strange mannerisms and fits of sudden laughter that unnerved classmates and teachers alike. Punished at home whenever he tried to make friends, Edward's world contracted to the barren soil of the farm and the ever-watchful eyes of his mother. As he grew, Edward's social isolation deepened. He never courted women or left the farm except for school or occasional odd jobs in the community. His older brother Henry grew more restless, but Edward remained a fixture of quiet obedience, his mother's shadow stretching long over his life. The deaths of his father in 1940, his brother Henry, under mysterious circumstances in 1944, and his mother in 1945, shattered what little normalcy remained. Augusta's death hit Edward hardest. His mother was not only the center of his world, but the sole source of affection and identity. After her passing, Edward locked away the rooms she had used most, the parlor, the upstairs bedroom, as though preserving her presence. The rest of the house fell into squalor, reflecting the fracturing of Edward's mind. The winter after Augusta Gyne died was long and brutal. Plainfield's wind swept cold through the bare trees, rattling the brittle windows of the Gyne farmhouse. Inside, Edward sat alone amid dust and shadows, a ghost tethered to the memory of his mother. The house, once orderly under Augusta's strict hand, now decayed like a tomb. The floorboards creaked under the weight of silence. Yet in one corner of this ruin, a shrine remained untouched, his mother's favorite rocking chair, a collection of her hymnals, the parlor curtains pulled tightly closed. Edward rarely spoke, his conversations with neighbors brief and awkward. When he did leave the farm, it was only to perform small jobs, handyman work, babysitting, or delivering milk from local farms. But always he returned, drawn inexorably to the solitary world he had known. It was during this time that Edward's interests turned dark. He developed a fascination with the human anatomy, spending hours poring over medical textbooks he acquired through secondhand shops. The pictures of bones, muscles, and organs consumed him. The boundaries between life and death blurred for Edward. He began visiting the local graveyard at night, creeping between the tombstones beneath a veil of darkness. There, he dug up freshly buried corpses, bringing back skin, bones, and organs to the farmhouse. These exhumations were not acts of cruelty alone. To Edward, they were ritualistic gestures, a desperate attempt to hold on to the dead, to touch, to wear, to become them. He crafted masks from human faces, belts from nipples, gloves from skin, piecing together a grotesque wardrobe in his silent madness. In the nearby town, people whispered of strange noises and eerie lights flickering from the Gyne farm at night, but fear and disbelief kept them away. Edward had become a figure of rumor, the odd recluse, the hermit who spoke little and saw fewer. His only meaningful connection remained the memory of his mother. Many who studied his case believe he sought to literally reconstruct her through the flesh and bones of others. Some experts have described his behavior as a psychotic response to profound grief, a deranged yearning for connection warped by years of isolation and repression.
But beneath the quiet horror, darker acts loomed. On a cold November morning in 1957, the small town of Plainfield awoke to unsettling news. Bernice Worden, a 58-year-old hardware store owner, had vanished. The cash register at her store was missing, and a chilling trail of blood led from the back door into the darkness beyond. Bernice's disappearance quickly became the focus of a tense investigation. Her son, Frank, a deputy sheriff, harbored a growing suspicion, a quiet, unsettling sense that the reclusive Ed Gein might be involved. Gein, who had been spotted near Bernice's store shortly before she disappeared, was brought in for questioning. Yet the grim reality awaiting the police at Gein's farm was far beyond anything they had anticipated. When officers entered the cluttered farmhouse, they were greeted by a scene from a nightmare. Bernice Worden's body hung suspended from the ceiling, decapitated and gutted. Her head was found later, concealed in a sack, while her heart dangled grotesquely in a plastic bag. But the horror did not end there. As investigators searched further, they uncovered a macabre collection of human remains. Jars filled with preserved organs, skulls repurposed as bowls, and a chilling belt constructed entirely from human nipples. The farmhouse had become a bizarre museum of death, a grim testament to the fractured mind of its occupant. Under intense questioning, Ed Gein confessed to the murders of Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had disappeared 3 years earlier. Both women resembled his deceased mother, Augusta, fueling speculation that Gein's crimes were twisted attempts to reconnect with her. Moreover, Gein admitted to exhuming corpses from local graveyards, mutilating the bodies, and using their parts to fashion masks, clothing, and household items. The extent of his necrophilic behavior shocked even the most seasoned officers. Authorities scrambled to link Gein to other unsolved disappearances, but no definitive evidence connected him to further murders. Still, the scope of his crimes ignited a wave of fear and fascination that spread well beyond Wisconsin's borders. Gein's atrocities earned him terrifying nicknames like the Butcher of Plainfield, the Plainfield Ghoul, and the Grandfather of Gore. His case became the subject of nationwide headlines and would inspire a new dark chapter in American cultural lore. Yet, amid the public horror and media frenzy, the legal system grappled with a more complicated question. Was Ed Gein sane? Was he criminally responsible for his horrific actions? Or was he a broken man beyond the reach of justice? The answers would unfold slowly, during a courtroom drama that exposed not only Gein's crimes, but also the limits of understanding madness. In the wake of his horrific confessions and the grisly evidence unearthed from his Plainfield farmhouse, Ed Gein faced the weighty machinery of the American justice system. Yet, the case was anything but straightforward. Following his arrest in late 1957, Gein's attorney, William Belter, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The defense strategy focused on Gein's mental state, arguing that the killer's warped actions were the product of profound psychological illness rather than cold-blooded criminality. Early psychiatric evaluations painted a disturbing portrait. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, Gein exhibited signs of delusional thinking, hallucinations, and a fragmented sense of reality. His bizarre fixation on his deceased mother, combined with his compulsive grave robbing and macabre craft work, pointed to a mind shattered by trauma and psychosis. In January 1958, the court deemed Gein unfit to stand trial. He was committed to Central State Hospital in Waupun, Wisconsin, a facility designed to house the mentally ill. There, his days were filled with regimented routines, punctuated by sessions of therapy and limited work opportunities as a mason, carpenter's assistant, and medical aide. For nearly a decade, Gein remained institutionalized, isolated from the public and largely forgotten by the world that had briefly recoiled in horror at his name. However, the justice system's patience was not infinite. By early 1968, new evaluations concluded that Gein was competent enough to stand trial. He could comprehend the charges against him and assist in his defense, crucial criteria for a fair legal process.
The trial commenced in November 1968. Though he had admitted to killing Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, prosecutors chose to pursue only the charge related to Worden's murder, a decision influenced by the complexity and graphic nature of the evidence, and a desire to avoid re-traumatizing the victims' families. In a courtroom packed with journalists, law enforcement, and curious townsfolk, the chilling details of Gein's crimes were laid bare. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence, the jury faced a complicated verdict. On one hand, Ed Gein was found guilty of first-degree murder, a legal recognition of his responsibility for Worden's death. On the other, the court declared that he was legally insane at the time of the crime. The distinction meant that while Gein was held accountable, he was also deemed incapable of understanding or controlling his actions in a conventional sense. The verdict resulted in Gein being recommitted to Central State Hospital, where he would spend the rest of his life. His institutional existence was marked by relative quietude. Unlike the media spectacle of the late 1950s and 60s, the man once dubbed the Butcher of Plainfield faded into obscurity within the cold walls of psychiatric care. In 1974, Gein made a rare attempt to petition for release, a move that shocked those who remembered his gruesome crimes. The plea was swiftly rejected, reinforcing society's resolve to keep him confined. As the years passed, Gein's health declined. In the late 1970s, he was transferred to the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, where he died in 1984 of lung cancer and respiratory illnesses. Despite the end of his life, Ed Gein's legacy endured, not only in headlines, but in the cultural imagination. His story challenged the boundaries of criminality and mental illness, raising questions about justice, morality, and the human psyche's darkest recesses.